All right, looks like we're live. Welcome everybody. My name's Brian Berger. I'm the editor of Space News. I'm glad everybody could join us here today for our webinar on blockchain and what it means for space. We decided to take a look at this topic for the November issue, taking a look at various applications of distributed ledger, blockchain, NFT, cryptocurrency. People are talking about all sorts of applications that can either apply directly to longstanding space challenges, or in some cases, it can be even used to finance some missions. We're hoping to make some sense of that today. Before I turn you over to my colleague, Deborah Werner, I want to thank today's sponsor for today's webinar. It's SpiderOak Mission Systems. To get us started, we have a short video from SpiderOak that we'll play right now.
The U.S. government created the Space Force for good reason, to protect and expand American space assets. A dramatic increase in the number and uses of satellites has led some operators to rely on third-party ground stations, split the roles of spacecraft, and even share payload operations with other entities. In hybrid, multi-party environments, cybersecurity can no longer be based on trust, and the cost of failure in space is high. Cyber attacks on space assets could result in disruptions to critical infrastructure that we all rely on. And if something goes down, there's no geek squad in space to fix it. SpiderOak Mission Systems is proud to introduce Orbit Secure, an agile, secure, lightweight communications and extreme key management solution to protect spacecraft and payloads. Leveraging a unique combination of blockchain and public-private key cryptology, Orbit Secure is designed to bring zero-trust security to zero-gravity environments. To learn more, visit spacecyber.com.
All right. Well, with that introduction, I want to turn it over to you, Deborah, to tee up today's discussion and introduce all of today's panelists.
Thank you. I'm Deborah Werner, a Space News correspondent in Silicon Valley. And I'm delighted that you're joining us today for this webinar on blockchain. Space News began looking at blockchain after a Satellite 2021 panel. And I was initially pretty skeptical after all of the talk that I had heard about it revolutionizing manufacturing and finance of everything. I was skeptical, but then I talked to a lot of experts, including the people on this panel, and came to realize that it will be important. It may take a long time to see some of these applications, but I believe it will be important for the space sector. So the people who are with me today can help explain that. And I hope we'll have a lively conversation. Feel free to put questions in the Q&A section of the Zoom panel, and we'll get to those during the conversation. So I'd like to introduce Karen Jones, Senior Project Leader and Technology Strategist for the Aerospace Corporation's Center for Space Policy and Strategy. Karen's paper, Blockchain in the Space Sector, which was part of the Center for Space Policy's Game Changer series, helped me understand why space companies and space agencies are investigating blockchain applications. And I'll put a link to that paper in the chat. Hashi Sudler is an adjunct professor at Villanova University, where he's working with students to test blockchain transactions in space. Hashi also leads the Internet Think Tank, a consulting firm focused on cybersecurity, including payments fraud, security information, event management, and data privacy. Matt Erickson is the Vice President of Solutions at SpiderOak, a federally focused startup developing space cybersecurity solutions using blockchain and zero trust security. SpiderOak subsidiary, SpiderOak Mission Systems, has been expanding its role in the space sector with work for government agencies, including the US Air Force. I'd like to start with Professor Sudler and say, why is blockchain technology important?
I think if we take a step back and look at what blockchain solves, it's actually helped us solve one of the most difficult problems that we've had in our conversion from the analog world to the digital world. And we've all been living this for the last 50 or 60 years, actually since the 1950s. We've been on the march of digitizing our world, moving postal mail to email and moving prints to JPEGs. And one of the things that was very difficult to convert actually was money, was cash money. And the reason this was difficult was because money, in terms of cash, has two properties. One, it holds value, what you would see on the face of the actual bill. And it also conveys who owns it. So if I'm holding a dollar bill and I give it to you, the moment it leaves my hand and it goes to your hand, you now hold ownership. So cash money actually has this very interesting and unique property where it holds these two types of properties that are very important to managing any form of asset. This, of course, not only applies to money, it applies to anything that is unique in which we want to transact. So what blockchain does is it really helps us make that step from the analog world where we have to deal with physical cash or physical assets to representing them digitally, and allowing us to take a file, essentially a file, and to make it unique. Now, of course, if we were to take any file, like a Word document or Excel, and if I said this particular file is worth some money, you'd laugh at me because you say, well, all you have to do is go, turn around and make 1 million copies of it. So we can't allow that. And what blockchain does is essentially puts uniqueness to each and every one of those files. And it also uses a number of servers. It has replicated servers that contain the exact same information. So the nature of the blockchain is that it's holding all of the information exactly on all of these servers, creating a common source of truth. And this gives it resilience against tampering. So someone cannot easily go back and change that truth because there are many other servers that have the exact same information. So when we look at the impact that blockchain has on our society, now we are able to transact physical assets in a digital form. And this is now opening up a wide variety of applications. Of course, cryptocurrency has been the first application that we've looked at with Bitcoin and the publishing of the paper by Satoshi Nakamoto or whoever that may represent in 2008, to many other applications where we not only represent money, but we also represent information. And we find the application of blockchain in so many different industries, whether it's supply chain management, whether it's putting the law or some piece of very critical information that may be a form of public record. All of these forms of transaction is what a blockchain can do, but it can do it by maintaining unique representation of those assets and a very secure, resilient way to prevent any form of hacking or tampering.
Got it. Thank you. So Karen, why does that matter to space agencies and companies? How is this applicable to them?
Well, space is changing, and there is more cooperation now between state actors internationally. There's more cooperation between commercial actors, and there's just generally more cooperation, more parties involved. Space has become democratized. So it is a share economy now. We're starting to hear about infrastructure as a service, ground station as a service, satellite as a service, public-private partnerships. So how can you get all these different parties to work together? They kind of trust each other and they kind of don't trust each other. So how can you get them to work and move away from some central authority into some kind of paradigm where you can have transparency and trust? And it's a combination of blockchain or digital ledger technology evolving at the same time the space industry is changing its culture. So it's extremely relevant right now. And the space industry has an opportunity to follow other industries that are already well along this learning curve. And I know, we had discussed the hype cycle here. There is a lot of hype, absolutely. with whether blockchain can solve, the world's problems. And there is a lot of jargon being thrown out. And Deborah, you used the word revolutionary before as well. And is it really revolutionary? And I think it's evolutionary. Incremental steps towards greater efficiencies, greater trust, using a shared immutable ledger will maybe over time create something that's maybe in hindsight revolutionary, but that's what we're seeing, incremental steps, and we're seeing other sectors lead, such as the financial sector, such as the food and drug sector. And the space sector has an opportunity to stand back, look at all these discrete applications that support various business processes and models, and to decide, what should we apply for the space sector?
Does anyone have anything to add, Matt or Hashi?
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the things where we're really at an interesting point technologically is that we have a chance to almost start over with how we think about global infrastructure. We have decades of baggage that we've brought forward with us with the terrestrial internet, and the operating in space is different. It is, even though people like to think about the internet doesn't have borders, there's borders. There's data center walls, there's firewalls, there's network partitioning. There's all sorts of places. Space, especially with modern free space optics and the radios that are being put up there, it's like one gigantic data center up above the planet in terms of just network topology. So how can we move forward with this really interesting new way to think about computing? Because that's what it really is. That's what most spacecraft really are, computers with sensors attached up in orbit. How can we think about moving forward with computing without bringing with us a lot of the baggage that we've accumulated here on Earth?
I would add, obviously space has become extremely exciting over the past few years. I think we've made leaps and bounds in just a very short span of time in terms of putting more satellites in space, humans in the space through private industries. Space is clearly open, and we've shown just in this year alone the introduction of civilians into space on private spacecraft. So certainly this is a new age. And if we look at the evolution of space, we know if we keep this trend up, that we will have a need for a space economy where people will be living in space in longer and longer durations. At some point, those individuals will want to transact with each other off of Earth. So the question is, will we always have Earth as the central location where everything needs to be settled? Or will we create an environment and infrastructure where individuals will be able to settle transactions directly, whether they're in the space station and they settle with each other, or they're on the moon, or perhaps even on Mars? So this is the very beginning. We're literally at the very beginning of this process of laying down the central infrastructure that is required for both people and new things to be able to interact independently of Earth. It is, Eric, Matthew mentioned that we certainly would be looking at space as a big data center as well. We already have so many satellites up there. How do we make those satellites communicate and transact directly with one another? There's a huge opportunity there as well. So I think we just see space, in terms of my view, as a huge extension of it. And now we're no longer constrained by our own gravity that keeps us on Earth. We're now starting to look at this new environment that we can start populating. And we know we need to lay out some infrastructure to make that happen.
Some of the questions we've got right away are about energy consumption, because we've all read that Bitcoin is using more energy than Finland. And so is this a problem for space-related blockchains?
I can certainly take that question because that's one of the first things we focused on in our research at the university. Would the basic proof of work, which is extreme energy hog that the Bitcoin blockchain uses, would it ever survive in space? And the quick answer is no. It's already an energy drain on Earth. It would drain the batteries of satellites very quickly. So we cannot use the same old consensus model that we first started the blockchain with, which is proof of work. We would need to adopt a proof of authority, a proof of stake, which does not use the same model that requires putting up an enormous amount of energy or proving that you are invested in confirming blocks on the blockchain by how much energy you expend. So the different consensus model, proof of authority, is the one that we are focused on, where basically what you're putting up is your reputation. And to each node, whoever is managing that node is essentially putting out their reputation and ensuring that that node is very secure. And if you do attempt to tamper, then the rest of the group would block you out of the blockchain. Now, that does require more of a private blockchain arrangement rather than the public blockchain arrangement we're used to with Bitcoin and Ethereum.
Karen, I see you nodding. Did you want to add?
Yeah, I think Bitcoin gave us a sense of everything's going to be open participation, open permission type of manifestation. And the reality is we're going to have closed, more permissioned kind of networks. You need to be a member of the club. And then if you are a member of the club with a permission type of ledger, you don't have to go through these various time-consuming and, in some cases, energy-intensive types of proof of work. So that eliminates a lot of that extra, power consumption that we really don't need for space.
Yeah. So what are the important space-related applications?
Well, I identified 7 in my paper, and to go through them, there were 7. I started with new ventures, which is an exciting one. It didn't seem that long ago that crowdfunding with Indiegogo and Kickstarter was new, but they had fees, and they were a middleman. 5% transaction fees, additional credit card fees. Well, a blockchain type of venture financing model could reduce that, make it more efficient and more transparent. So that was one. Smart contracts is obviously one that is taking off rapidly. It involves embedded logic and automating business processes. The one that's talked about quite a bit in the aviation sector is supply chain management. I think what we're going to see there is the space sector will follow the aviation sector. Boeing gets over 1 million parts per day from over 5,000 vendors in their plants. So they have a huge motivation to move to something that's smarter, more automated, and more transparent with their ecosystem of vendors. And maybe they'll begin to translate that into space as well. But we will be following the food and drug sectors that are well on their way with supply chain management types of blockchain functions. And IBM has some very interesting products, as well as other companies that could be tweaked. So again, we're coattailing onto these lessons learned from other industries. Networking and communications is one that's going to take off as we embark upon mesh networking and hybrid constellations. How do you get these nodes to communicate to each other? And how do you ensure you know who you're speaking with? And how can you ensure that these handoffs are safe? We'll see more of that in the future. ID management is one that every industry needs. There's a lot of fraud out there. Space will probably use it for things here on Earth. How do you access a facility? The one that's very interesting, and when I wrote this paper, non-fungible tokens had not quite taken off. And by the way, I think they're at the top of the hype cycle right now, or NFTs. The application around IP and digital rights. It's a crazy time right now. We just saw an artist in South Carolina who received over $69 million for a piece of digital art. Amazing. What is going on in that sector? We're at the height of that hype cycle. Let's see where that goes. Are there opportunities in space? Yes, and that involves, for instance, imagery rights, being able to track how your imagery is being used and by who. And finally, the one that's going to be very, very interesting is space traffic management. How do we embark upon this? And that is actually a rather large umbrella. I spoke to one of our experts at the Aerospace Corporation about it, and she said, really think of it in terms of two functions. One is the data and data formatting and verifying the data. And the second part would be the conjunction analysis. Both parts could be addressed by digital ledger technology. So those are the 7 applications in general that I identified, and they are in different places in the hype cycle. Some are creeping out of the trough of despair and moving on to what is it called? The slope of enlightenment. So we are getting there. We're making progress. We'll see where it all goes.
So Matt, I thought of you when Karen said, how do you ensure you know who you're speaking with, and how do you trust the information?
Yeah, and that's within blockchain concepts overall. The idea of cryptographically proven identity is just kind of native to what blockchains are. So instead of having names that are easily messed up or cloned or copied, you start using public-private key pairs, not signed by CAs, as either wallets or identifiers or otherwise what you're in the system. And because of everything else is verifying all the actions going on, you can start creating these peer-to-peer cryptographically assured lists of who's supposed to be talking to whom, what rights are within the system, and otherwise stop relying on central authorities like directories and certificate authorities for the correctness of a security system. And that's, we've been seeing that already start to play out with experiments in privacy and security, such as the differences between Bitcoin and, say, Zcash. And I think taking that further into purpose-built IDAM, ICAM solutions on blockchain, like, not to toot our own horn, but SpiderOaks, start to get really interesting.
Hashi, anything you wanted to add about space-related applications?
Well, I think Karen touched upon this really interesting area of traffic management. And this is first of all, a very big problem with so many different satellites being put into space. And now the satellites have to be extra careful not to crash into one another. So there's a huge need for this traffic management among satellites and to have that data. Currently, all of the data of satellite positions and the orbits are all managed actually out of the US. So we maintain essentially a universal list for all countries and companies that are putting things in space. There certainly is a need to democratize that process so that not one country is holding all of this information. It would be great if there were a network that held that information and it was independent of any company or country, but we could certainly rely on it. And it held a very strong source of truth such that no one can go around and tamper with it and say, well, my satellite is not here or it's not following a very specific orbit. It's going to be very critical because we are coming to a point here with the very sharp increase in launches where it's very possible there could be collisions, and the debris from those collisions certainly can create other collisions, and you'll have this cascading effect. So we need to be able to transact information in that sense. And we feel this is one of the most important applications we need to look at in terms of traffic management of satellites themselves and collision avoidance to ensure we do not run into that situation where we create more debris that will obviously be very dangerous for anyone living in space or astronauts on the ISS and any other satellites that may be functioning in that space.
One of the questions, somebody asked, could space agencies trust a decentralized network?
Well, I think that's a really big question, and it's one that we're asking at the university. We understand and we like the idea of putting blockchains in space, but we want to answer the question definitively, can we trust it? And the only way to really do that is we have to put the blockchain under a stress test. We have to put blockchains in various configurations, starting with very simple configurations, assuming that if someone were to deploy a full blockchain of maybe 100 nodes, that many of those nodes could potentially be put out of use simply by a large solar flare. And assuming that happens and you end up with a very small percent of functioning blockchain nodes, what happens then? Can you trust that particular network? Obviously, security-wise, there's some huge implications in terms of getting it right and not propagating errors on any one of those nodes to other nodes through the gossip protocol. That's an issue, that's a question. So we need to look at the scenarios based on different topologies. We start with a very simple one and then we build it out to see what are some of the logistical challenges blockchains face in terms of synchronization, in terms of just seeing each other and updating each other in terms of the gossip protocol. And what happens if radiation does play a bigger role in the functioning of blockchain than we currently may understand. So we do need to look at the blockchain from all angles.
Got it. Got it. So, Matt, I want to make sure that our audience understands SpiderOak's role in this sector. So what does SpiderOak do?
So SpiderOak produces a zero trust decentralized authority model for IDAM, ICAM applications. And on top of that, provides data messaging and transfer, as well as key management for legacy applications. So that's a lot of words. But first off, it comes down to using something. We didn't actually set out to build a blockchain. We're not a company that said we're going to play in the blockchain space, so we're going to pick up a blockchain and do something with it. We said, how do we get the technical ability to know to match need to know? How do we make that Venn diagram a simple circle? And we wound up with a directed acyclic graph that if you zoom in at various parts of it, looks astonishingly like a blockchain. So in that, what do? We want to make it possible for endpoints such as spacecraft to asynchronously and in a peer-to-peer fashion prove the authority of the comms channels that they're in and be able to compute keys for secure communication between those endpoints. That's really what we do. We have a team collaboration tool on top of it, and the video that kicked this off about our space offerings under the umbrella Orbit Secure. But really that core of that distributed IDAM concept is what SpiderOak does.
Got it. Great. One of the questions we're getting, and it's interesting, the questions are very similar to all of the questions that I had. And Karen, you might be the best person to help us. Can you picture blockchain getting through the regulatory hoops? Right now, satellite communications is licensed. This could be a long-term issue.
Yes, I'll start with spectrum management. Interesting dilemma. It's actually got some similarities with orbits. We're talking about managing finite resources. How do you do that as a regulatory authority with multiple parties? So one idea for spectrum is to set aside a unique, maybe pioneer spectrum, something very high frequency, and look at how you can do dynamic spectrum allocation. And it has to be fast. I think it would have to be some type of permissioned ledger. But that's one application. Maybe start with a prototype and see how quick it is and how effective it is. And does it engender trust with all the players involved? That's one. Possibly do the same thing with maybe some orbital slots. And you could have some kind of allocation kind of authority for that as well. But it has to start with prototyping and enough transparency so that the space players feel confident with their investments.
Yes, I love this question. One question is, how do you suggest engineers like myself approach management and talk to them about investing R&D resources in blockchain in space? The common stigma is that blockchain is only for Bitcoin, but clearly that's not the case. I can see everything I've read is to start with these small prototyping projects.
And I would also encourage management to whether it's taking a course or doing some reading on these non-cryptocurrency related applications. Sometimes you really do need to take a step back from understanding blockchain as just a cryptocurrency or Bitcoin play. Bitcoin is simply the first application of the blockchain. And in my courses, one of the things I like to do is really start my course by teaching them or reminding them about the internet and how the internet evolved. There was a time where email was really the only thing you'd associate with the internet, back when I was in university. And it certainly has evolved so much since then to web applications. So we need to think of the evolution of the blockchain in the same way we've experienced the evolution of the internet. And remember that the blockchain is still in its infancy. We essentially just passed the 10-year anniversary of the blockchain, so it's extremely young technology. But people should think about the 4 different use cases, and I've created a framework that really helps people to remember this. It's called apps. Hopefully that should be very easy for everyone to remember, APPS. The first A stands for asset management, essentially representing physical things or maybe even digital things with the blockchain token. So think NFTs or think tokens that might represent physical assets like gold or what have you. The next would be the first P, which would be payments. So we're very familiar with that because that's where cryptocurrencies really came in. Is really, hey, this is something that you can use to pay things for. The second is public records. We can actually transact information and store it on the blockchain in an immutable fashion. So public records has been very interesting to governments. Particularly Canada has been using public records application of blockchain to store government information so that it's transparent and everyone can see it for themselves. And the final is supply chain management, which we've talked about in terms of aviation and looking at supply chain parts, but we also see this in the food industry and farm industry. So these are the 4 major application areas. So whenever I talk to people about blockchain, I really want them to be familiar with this full spectrum of use cases that blockchain is useful for, not just payments.
I think it would also be really helpful for the audience to hear about what you're planning at Villanova, what you plan to test in terms of blockchain in space.
Sure. So our research into blockchains in space started a couple of years ago, and this really kicked off from discussions I had with one of my graduate students. We clearly saw an uptick in the number of launches that were happening. And I was teaching my blockchain course, and my student was very interested in space and also looking at the dynamics of blockchain. And we started looking at what is the combination, where's the intersection between space development and blockchain networks. Just looking at it as a pure network technology that certainly could exist in space. There had also been some work done by organizations like SpaceChain. And they are some of the forerunners in having a lot of experience in launching some blockchains in space and testing them out. So we knew the concept was not unique that we dreamed up. This is something people were really starting to think about. But we wanted to explore exactly how blockchain would function in space and what use cases might occur. Over the last couple of years, we have really solidified a research team. We have been working very closely with an organization, Teachers in Space. They've developed a satellite, which they have secured on a Firefly Alpha launch vehicle. We did our first attempt to launch our experiment on the Firefly launch rocket in early September. Fortunately, that launch did not go as planned. It did take off for about 2 minutes and then it exploded. This was indeed the first time the rocket was launched and the first time this company is launching a rocket. So it's not uncommon. We will be trying again at the end of January, early February for the next launch attempt. And so we're in the process right now of just rebuilding the satellite and as Firefly is rebuilding its rocket. So we're very much on the approach to look at how do we test blockchain out in a variety of use cases. We're going to be testing basic token transactions. We'll be testing some smart contract transactions. In terms of if satellites were to transact with one another, they would have to go through a bit of handshaking and announcing some information to each other. For example, one satellite that is looking for information is saying, hey, I need this information The other satellite would say, yes, I haven't. And so there's some conversation that needs to happen between the satellites. And once they agree on the content as well as the price, we expect the satellites will actually settle between each other. Then the sending satellite would actually send that information off chain, but will commit the transaction over the blockchain, and the receiving satellite would pay for that information over the blockchain. And that creates an immutable record. So we want to test that process as well. We're also testing the communication between the satellite and ground station. So we want to see how satellites will update the ground station, particularly given the fact that a satellite will be out of view from a single ground station for 90 minutes as it makes its way around the Earth in low Earth orbit. Now, this creates some interesting dynamics for any network because it's a very dynamic network. It's unlike on Earth where all the servers are sitting still in a data center somewhere. In space, they're moving very quickly, 17,000 miles per hour. And sometimes they'll be in view of a ground station, sometimes they'll be in view of each other, and sometimes they won't. And we really need to understand, depending on how many of these nodes you have operating, what will be the delay, what will be any implication to syncing up those nodes so that they do all have the same information and they're not talking, cross purposes.
Yes, there was a question about delay and if that could cause problems for these networks. So you investigate it.
From my perspective, absolutely. We certainly know that latency will be a part of the equation. We know as we go further out in space, you're going to have some of that latency. And we know that if we want to do transactions in space, that latency will not be desirable. So we want to eliminate the latency, which is why blockchain in space really helps, because any kind of peer-to-peer transactions in space off Earth should happen with minimal latency. But if it takes time, you don't want to wait an hour and a half for a particular node to sync up information. So you do need to have enough nodes such that the information will be propagated across the network fairly quickly. So nodes should be able to see enough peers to at any given point in time to be able to communicate that information at the speed of light, and things should be updated fairly quick. Now, we dovetail this on top of another thread of research we're doing at the university, which is the radiation-induced errors. Even if you have a very well-structured blockchain, the sun may not want to cooperate. It may have a mass coronal ejection at any given point in time. I believe we're in an uptick right now for lots of solar storms. And this could disable quite a number of satellites, not just blockchain satellites, but any satellite. And this creates a problem for the stability and integrity of the overall network itself.
And we need to trust the integrity of the network because that's what we've got.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if we want to really, obviously we're doing financial transactions, but I think there'll be, even more critical piece of information that we put on the blockchain, information that could relate to astronauts' health, positions of satellites. This is not transacting money. It's holding information in a very trustworthy manner and an immutable manner. And that information can be so critical that lives may depend on it. So we really do have to make sure we understand the limits of blockchain. It's not that we can't solution out of those limits, but we do need to understand the limits.
Yeah, got it. So I want to talk about the long-term potential of blockchain. Matt, when you and I spoke, we had an interesting conversation about new space versus old space. Why is blockchain important for this new era of venture financed space and many different companies and government agencies forming these hybrid networks?
That's a great question. The really cool thing about new space is that the cost of putting something in orbit is going down tremendously. Access to space is cheaper than it's ever been, and by all accounts is going to get even cheaper over time. So a lot of new players can play, but that becomes an issue when you're trying to interoperate up there. It's not just like you're going to connect Cat5 between everything and get it all talking to each other. And traditional legacy space are very vertically integrated missions. You own the spacecraft, you own the payload, you own the ground station, you own the processing segment, you own the customers, you are the customer. Whereas this, you might have different different commercial entities operating out of different countries, accessing other companies' imaging or communications capabilities to service maybe themselves, maybe a third party. And so one of the cases where blockchain really shines in general is, do I trust who's ever running the database? That's one of the key questions to ask yourself if you're like, should I just use SQL for this or should I try a blockchain? If you can trust who's ever holding the database, great. But this is such, they talk about proliferated LEO, and that's, it's a huge game changer where you might not own any of the chain. You might be renting a virtual payload on a compute module that's renting time on a bus, that is renting access from ground stations, that is renting access from processing segments. So every step along the way is somebody else completely altogether. And that's a great case where, that's a great example of new space in a case where blockchain and other distributed models with trust baked in at the data-centric architecture level shine.
Got it. So Karen, back to your space traffic management example. We're getting a lot of questions on that, and what that looks like, and why blockchain might be better than other technological solutions for sharing data.
Primarily, if it's centralized, decentralized, excuse me, and a permissioned type of application could allow these parties who may not totally trust each other to share information. And I would imagine part of this blockchain application would be the conjunction analysis itself. Start with prototyping, see how it plays out, work with all parties with full transparency to see how this will play out, and then build upon that with all space players involved through this permissioning system. And I think we need to go there. I don't know how else we can do it. I mean, we just, our risks have quadrupled as of last week in certain orbits, unfortunately, right around the space station. How can we move forward? And we have to work with parties we don't trust. Space is there for everyone at this point. It's so democratized. We have no choice. A siloed space traffic management system will serve no one. So this is the direction we need to go. It has to be shared. It has to be transparent. I want to add here that here on the planet, we have the revolution that still hasn't quite happened around autonomous cars and the Internet of Things. How do you make all this work together? They're talking about using blockchain applications for that as well. Maybe we'll be able to harvest some lessons learned, collision management with cars in space. I realize it's much more complicated in many ways. The velocities are much higher. But these are hard problems. It's going to take a lot of prototyping to solve these.
Yeah. Another question, Hashi, does blockchain or distributed ledger technology set the stage for complex automated intersatellite transactions?
Absolutely. And that's really what we are investigating in the long-term game of this is if satellites can actually interact directly with one another and perform complex transactions, that completely opens up this world that Karen's talking about, the kind of the real growth of IoT, because now each node that is a satellite is an IoT device. And with AI and the support of more sophisticated software, those satellites can acquire information, they can process that information, they can actually sell that information to other satellites or at least share it. So we're looking at taking advantage or really leveraging the power of all the satellites that we already have in space and the new ones coming up, each collecting some rather unique information, perhaps because of their unique orbits and positions, and to be able to leverage that for other satellites and helping those satellites complete their own missions. So I think we're going to look at satellites now really looking at each other as peers and being able to transact with one another based on useful information that any one satellite has to work out, perhaps the complex pricing structures that may happen depending on what it takes for a satellite to push that energy, push that information to another satellite. There's energy involved in doing that. So in terms of the complex pricing models and structures, we could find ourselves with a very dynamic environment where satellites transact very valuable information to other satellites that belong to certain companies or countries.
I also want to take a little time before we finish up to talk about some of the challenges or impediments here. And so one of those, Karen, you mentioned the need to digitize everything. And this is something that the Steve Buteau, the Defense Innovation Unit Space Portfolio Director, mentioned in a recent webinar. He sees great potential, but we don't have that space internet set up yet.
Right. So it's interesting because I've worked in a group called IBM's e-business strategy group in the early 2000s. And I witnessed some serious transformation around e-business strategy as commercial companies tried to figure out how to be more efficient and how to work better with their partners. And starting in the late 90s, this thing called enterprise resource planning, ERPs, came along. And in the US, over the 90s, companies spent over $300 billion basically installing these ERP systems. They started internal to their own networks and their own people, and then they started to look at their ecosystems of partners, customers, and suppliers. So companies are becoming digital, and that revolution or evolution started in the 90s, and it's continued. I really see blockchain as a natural evolution on top of that. It just takes time. And if you start to look at when these ERP systems started and where we are now in 2021, 30 years. It took 30 years. And that's why I think it will take as long to really see the true potential of distributed ledger technology across American industry and across the space sector. It just takes time. There's a lot of introspection. There's a lot of strategy. There's a lot of culture changes that need to happen. There's fear around it, people changing their jobs, losing their jobs. So all that needs to occur.
Yeah. Matt, do we also need standards?
Oh boy, do we. Right now, there are a variety of standards. There are standards that are enforced by, say, SDA for their systems to communicate with each other. There's common standards for radios, but there's no higher level standards of how devices can operate in a variable trust multilateral environment. And then coming down to industry regulation, that's often set with standards, everything from the EAR's ITARs to how different governments focus on encouraging different industries. Like, do we want to repeat the drone situation with DJI? And heavily we considered drones munitions, and now everyone's buying DJIs. Do we want to be able to, even though, say, a bit of software might have been developed in a defense context, does it need to be considered a defense article? And can it just be sold on the open market to whoever finds it useful? Things like that on both ends of the regulatory standards, as well as just the industrial standards of how things talk to each other, both need to mature rapidly. And I think, honestly, yesterday.
Yeah. Hashi, you mentioned this. Another impediment could be confidence in the network. We have to have confidence in the network.
Absolutely. We cannot really say blockchain is a winning technology until we can prove that blockchain can instill that confidence in some of the mission critical situations we may need it. So just to give an example of some of these mission critical situations, not only would we kind of look at the blockchain for, say, managing traffic between one another, that's pretty mission critical to make sure there's no collision. But what if you have situations where in the future there are colonies or these space stations where people are forming their own laws, and in those laws, this may seem very distant from the blockchain, but they need some way to really record what the law is, and to make sure no one's tampering with that law. Are you going to have Earth kind of maintain the law for you? Or will this colony be able to maintain a version of the law as they see fit, as they have decided on their own blockchain? Blockchain is quite useful for that because of its immutability. So we have to remember that individuals in space, as we really start to populate space, carrying up law books is not going to be an option, right? That just will not make sense. Weight will always be a premium to get up into space. Most of individuals who will be operating in that theater are going to be operating in a very digital manner. So if we feel we're running a digital lives here on Earth, multiply that by 100, that's how individuals in space will be operating. Everything will be digital. If you can make it digital, do it. But if you're going to be digital, you have to make sure that they are extremely secure, and you can't tamper with them. So these are situations that involve information and involves just trust in a very common set of documented public records for which our lives are based on, for which anarchy could occur if we're not careful, if it's not properly managed. So that's why we do have to make sure that the blockchain overall needs to be fairly stable, very trustworthy, and we need to understand the circumstances by which that trustworthiness is achieved, whether it's having a large number of satellites and whatever that number may be, whether it's swapping out satellites after they've been up there for a certain period of time and passing through the Van Allen belt a certain number of times and pick up charged particles. And after a while, they may be very prone to bit errors and bit flips. So if we know that's going to happen after a certain period of time, there may be a rule that you need to swap out one of those blockchain nodes after a certain period. So the reliability and assurance that it will do the right thing is at the core of the successful blockchain space.
Well, a helicopter is going by just as I wanted to ask a question, but I spent most of the time learning about this and understanding that blockchain and distributed ledger technology does not mean Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. Nevertheless, why are JP Morgan and Blockstream Satellite and Space Chain looking at this? Because of cryptocurrency, right?
Well, I've certainly have taken a look at what JP Morgan's doing. They are very focused on the financial aspect. They know payments is going to extend into space. And JP Morgan is not the only financial institution that has expressed that. MasterCard has expressed that. PayPal has expressed that. These payments companies know, and banks, they know that space will be a place where people will operate and that transactions will happen and payments will happen. So certainly we need to keep our eyes on the payments in that apps framework that we talked about. Payments is going to be a very key piece of that equation. Space Chain has been focused a lot on not only transactions of actual cryptocurrency, but also information. So they also realize that people will want to commit information in space for various purposes. And they're really trying to ensure that the technology is resilient and is strong and it kind of is fit for purpose. And we also have Bitstream, which is an organization that is allowing off-Earth settlement or transaction of Bitcoin. So you don't have to just transact Bitcoin on Earth anymore. You now have satellites up in space to allow Bitcoin transactions to happen. We're going to see a lot of different applications of blockchain in space, not just crypto. So I think we just need to be creative in how we apply it.
Yeah. it was just interesting after I learned to set aside crypto to understand that it actually is a piece of this puzzle. And some of those companies have an awful lot of money to extend their networks into space if they decide to do so.
Absolutely.
I'll add here, the U.S. Clearinghouse on interbank payment systems transfers $1.8 trillion daily. And if you can do it faster, possibly using constellations with optical inter-satellite links and buy yourself a few milliseconds of advantage, what can you do with that? And how is JP Morgan looking at that time advantage? Because transmitting through space, free space, is a lot faster than fiber optics, which is typically what they rely on, undersea fiber optics.
Great. We're coming to the end of the hour. I wonder if any of my panelists have anything else that they wanted to say.
Well, I think, Deborah, yeah, go ahead, Matthew.
Oh, well, thank you. Sorry about that. So I think one of the, to everyone's point, we're just seeing the start of this. This is, to Karen's comment about ERP, like we're talking about potential applications of Bitcoin as if we're talking about, or not Bitcoin, sorry, blockchain. Too much talk about a cryptocurrency. But almost as if, imagine we were a panel in the 1960s talking about high-speed data networking and relational databases. We're at that phase of trying to peer into the future. There's a future that's oncoming like a truck. It's not going to stop. We're trying to understand that before it gets here, and there's a wide world out there.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of reflect the discussions that certainly folks like Elon Musk have had about Mars, and these are very ambitious goals. But really, for the first time in human history, are we talking about going to Mars quite seriously? Certainly going back to the moon to stay. And if we really start thinking about the longer term goal, whether this is going to happen over the next 10, 20, or 30 years, now we have to start thinking about intergalactic communication and transactions. One of the major motivations for, say, Elon Musk to be very interested in Dogecoin and other cryptocurrencies is he's really looking at some form of currency that would operate on another planet. So whether that's Dogecoin or whatever, he realizes that there is some form of transaction that would need to happen over between Earth and Mars. Obviously, Mars would be dependent on Earth for quite some time. And there has to be some currency mechanism for that to support it. So if you look at individuals who are really trying to vie for off-world living, whether it's on the moon or Mars, blockchain now kind of serves this critical link between Earth and other planets, when that day comes. And so this groundwork of infrastructure is being laid, and certainly Elon Musk's interest in the long-term success of cryptocurrencies, I think, is partly founded on that.
Karen?
Yeah, I'll just say that I think a lot of earthly applications involving business processes to make the space sector more efficient will probably be where we're looking first. What can we improve? Where can we create better trust? Where can we increase our margins as a result of these efficiency gains? That might be the near-term wins for digital ledger technology for the space sector.
Great. Thank you all so much. It's been really nice talking to you all about this.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, before we sign off, everybody, I wanted to share a few brief programming notes. Again, thanks everybody for joining us for this conversation. I do want to thank SpiderOak Mission Systems for helping to make today's event possible. Matt was already on the panel before we set off in search of a sponsor, so we appreciate that flexibility and generosity on SpiderOak's behalf. Well, we hope you'll consider joining us back here next month, Monday, December 6th, for the Space News Awards. We're going to reveal all 9 of this year's award winners. But here's the really exciting part. It's looking like we're going to have all of this year's winners with us live that afternoon. for an all-star MVP panel discussion. We're gonna chew over this watershed year and kind of look ahead to the challenges and opportunities to come. So more details on that soon. A couple of the speakers will be able to identify ahead of time, but the rest we will not, because you're going to have to tune in on December 6th to find out who won. Finally, a recording of today's panel discussion will be posted very soon on spacenews.com. We'll also make sure that we have links to the articles Deborah wrote for our blockchain special. I think we can throw in Matt had written an op-ed for us on cybersecurity. We can put that in and a link to Karen's paper as well. If there's anything else we forgot, Deborah, just let me know after we conclude here.
Great.
All right. Thanks everybody, and have a good holiday. Take care.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.